The city of Blackwood was a scar of concrete and neon, a place where the shadows felt thicker than the air. Officer Jake Riley, fresh out of the academy, was assigned to the notoriously quiet Precinct 7, a beat locals jokingly called the Silent Zone. It sat on the edge of the abandoned industrial district, a brick monument to forgotten governance. His first graveyard shift was a baptism by fire of boredom. The station was a cavern of stale coffee and echoing footsteps. The only other person was Desk Sergeant Alara Vance, a woman whose eyes held the exhaustion of 1,000 shifts, her face perpetually etched with the subtle, unnerving anxiety. "Welcome to the fun house, Riley," Alara murmured, not looking up from her crossword. "Rule number 1, don't break anything. Rule number 2, don't call me unless you're bleeding. Rule number 3, well, you'll figure out rule 3. Jake tried to laugh, but the sound died in the empty space between the steel desks. He spent the first 3 hours filling out forms for traffic tickets written weeks ago. The silence was the worst, not just the absence of noise, but a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press in from the walls. T2:17 a.m. The first call came through the antiquated radio system. It wasn't a crime. It was an anomaly report from the city's derelict record system, a code 712, unauthorized echo. "A what?" Jake frowned, looking at Alara. Alara's pencil stopped mid-stroke. Her head snapped up, the anxiety in her eyes crystallizing into pure fear. "Ignore it, Riley. It's a phantom signal. Old system glitch." But the dispatcher sounded robotic, and it mentioned the South Wing. The South Wing. Everyone knew about the South Wing. It was sealed off, supposedly because of structural damage from a fire a decade ago. But whispers persisted among the old-timers. It was where the old evidence went to rot, evidence from cases that were never truly closed. Jake felt a pull, a rookie's hunger for anything to break the monotony. "I'm going to check the breaker panel for the system, Alara. Probably just a short." Before Alara could protest, Jake was moving. He strapped on his service belt, the weight of the Glock a comfort. The main hall, with its fluorescent buzz, gave way to a dimly lit corridor leading to the South Wing access door. As he got closer, the suffocating silence cracked. A faint sound, like a muffled, wet gasp, seemed to float from behind the sealed steel door. He stopped, heart hammering against his ribs. "Got a phantom signal. A glitch." Alara's words played in his mind, but his gut screamed a different story. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the access door. It wasn't just cold. It was vibrating faintly. Then, the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't a gasp. It was a recording of a woman screaming, cut short by a heavy thud. And then, a new sound, chillingly close to his ear, from the empty hallway behind him. A whisper, thin as razor wire. "You shouldn't have listened, Riley." Jake spun around, gun drawn, sweeping the deserted corridor. Nothing. He was alone that he looked back at the South Wing door, the blood draining from his face. The air in the hallway felt suddenly colder, and the faint vibration in the door intensified at a glitch. He knew, with a certainty that iced his veins, that this was no glitch. This was a door that shouldn't be answered, and something on the other side had just noticed him. The whisper clung to Officer Jake Riley like an icy shroud. He lowered his Glock slightly, his knuckles white against the grip. The hallway was empty, yet the chilling sensation of being watched was overwhelming. He knew the protocol: secure the scene, wait for backup. But in Precinct 7, backup was Sergeant Alara Vance, and she was already terrified. He holstered his weapon, his eyes locked on the sealed South Wing door. The faint, high-pitched whine from the vibrating steel was now almost a low hum, like a distant, distorted siren. The sound of the woman screaming was gone, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of something waiting. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Jake pulled the heavy emergency tool from his belt, a steel-tipped pry bar often used for jammed evidence lockers. The door was sealed by 2 sets of heavy-duty padlocks and a metal bolt welded over the top latch. "Riley, get back here. That's a direct order." Alara's voice crackled through his radio, laced with panic. Jake ignored her, focusing on the bottom padlock. He wedged the pry bar into the shackle, grunting as he put his full weight into it. The steel groaned, then snapped with a sharp, echoing clang that seemed deafening in the silence. He moved to the next, quicker this time, fueled by nervous adrenaline. The second lock gave way. The welded bolt was trickier. He used the end of the bar to hammer against the weakest point of the weld, the metallic thud-thud-thud vibrating through the floor. Finally, with a loud scrape, the bolt snapped off. Jake paused, his hand hovering over the heavy steel handle. He twisted the handle and pulled the door open, bracing himself for the sight of dust, debris, and the aftermath of a fire. What he saw was neither. The south wing hallway stretched before him, impossibly long and unnaturally wide, far larger than the precinct's blueprint suggested. The air was frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and old blood. The fluorescent lights overhead were working, but their light was wrong, a sickly, sulphurous yellow that cast deep, shifting shadows. The corridor was immaculate. There was no fire damage, no dust, only a perfectly maintained, terrifying emptiness. As he stepped across the threshold, the outer door slammed shut behind him with a resonant boom that made him jump. He tried the handle. Locked. He was sealed in. Ilara, I'm in the south wing. The door sealed behind me. Everything in here, it's not right. He reported into his radio. Only static answered. Jake raised his flashlight, though the ceiling lights provided an eerie illumination. He started walking, his footsteps echoing too many times, as if 10 men were walking with him. Echoes. The code 712. He passed a row of sealed, dark-stained wooden doors, old offices or interrogation rooms. He heard the echoes again, not of his footsteps, but faint, distorted voices whispering from behind the wood. They weren't distinct words, just a confusing, panicked cacophony of sound. Then, his flashlight beam fell on something glinting near his foot. He knelt down, picking up a small, corroded piece of metal. It was a police officer's shield, the eagle emblem tarnished and the serial number scratched beyond legibility. But the precinct number was clearly stamped on the back. Precinct 4. Jake's blood ran cold. Precinct 4 had been condemned and demolished 5 years ago after a scandal involving missing persons and internal cover-ups. Why was its badge here, inside the sealed, supposedly fire-damaged south wing of Precinct 7? As he stood up, pocketing the badge, the whispers behind the wooden doors coalesced. They formed one clear, mournful sound, repeating the same word, over and over, from all directions at once. Found. 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 Jake ran, his boots slapping against the polished tile, the sound echoing ahead of him and then immediately behind him, almost catching up. He ran until he saw the end of the impossible hallway. A single, heavy door marked simply evidence. He didn't hesitate. He needed to get out, or at least find something solid, something real. He threw the door open and plunged into the darkness. Officer Jake Riley crashed through the evidence door, the heavy slam cutting off the terrifying chorus of found. He stopped, panting, plunged into absolute darkness and the immediate, overwhelming smell of mold, dust, and something sharply metallic, like old copper. He flicked his powerful tactical flashlight on. The beam revealed an endless, vertical maze of steel shelving units, towering 30 feet high and receding into the blackness. This wasn't a standard evidence room. It was a vast, subterranean warehouse, silent save for the drip-drip-drip of water somewhere deep inside. The Precinct 4 badge in his pocket was growing warm, radiating a subtle, persistent heat. He started moving cautiously down the narrow aisle, the flashlight scanning the ancient shelves. The shelves were filled, not with plastic bins, but with manila envelopes tied with deteriorating twine, each yellowing, brittle label handwritten in neat, sloping script. He pulled one down. The label read, Case File 1998-032. Subject, Deputy Marshal G. Kincaid. Classification, Missing Persons. He pulled another. Case File 2005-180. Subject, Detective S. Rourke. Classification, Disappeared. The cold realization struck him, heavier than the air. The files weren't organized by case number. They were organized by name, specifically the names of law enforcement officers who had vanished over the past 3 decades from various precincts across the city. The dates on the files spanned back to the 1980s. He ran his hand along the shelf, feeling the thick dust. His finger brushed against a small, flat object. He picked it up and held it to the light, a small, tarnished wedding band, engraved with the initials DR, and a date, 11/14/01. Detective S. Rourke. The file he just looked at. Rourke's badge, Rourke's case file, and now Rourke's wedding ring. All preserved here, categorized and cataloged in the impossible south wing of Precinct 7. Who put all this here? Jake whispered, his voice thin. That's when the light from his flashlight caught a movement at the far end of the aisle. A shadow, tall, distorted, and too large for any normal man, slipped quickly behind the towering racks. Jake froze, his training momentarily taking over the fear. He dropped into a defensive stance, raising the flashlight and the Glock. Police. Show yourself. Silence. Only the sound of the dripping water. That he took a step forward. The badge in his pocket was now uncomfortably hot, burning through his uniform trousers. He checked the nearest shelf. The files were getting newer. That he found one labeled Case File 2018-009. Subject, Officer M. Sterling. Classification, Internal Transfer. Confirmed, Internal Transfer. Jake knew Sterling, a patrolman from Precinct 3, who had suddenly quit the force 5 years ago without a word, rumored to have transferred to an obscure federal agency. Yet here was his file, filed among the missing. Jake snatched the file open, tearing the twine. Inside, there was no transfer paperwork, no resignation letter, just a single piece of evidence. Officer Sterling's patrol uniform shirt, meticulously folded, except for a large, ragged hole in the back near the shoulder blade. Tucked into the collar was a small, white piece of paper. The paper was brittle. It contained only 2 words, written in the same neat, sloping script as the file labels. The Architect. As Jake stared at the paper, absorbing the cryptic message, the aisle lights, a single, bare bulb on a pulled chain, flickered on directly behind him. He spun around, blinded by the sudden, weak light. Standing less than 20 feet away, at the mouth of the aisle, was the figure he'd seen. Not a shadow, but a man. He was wearing a perfectly clean, archaic police uniform from the 1950s. High collar, thick wool coat, but his face was the horror. It was featureless, smooth, and pallid, like wet clay stretched over a skull, with only 2 deep, black indentations where the eyes should have been. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound, but the cold in the room dropped to a searing intensity, and the chilling silence was now a tangible, physical presence. "What are you?" Jake choked out, aiming his gun. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the featureless face began to tilt its head slowly, a deep, unsettling cracking sound accompanying the movement. And then, the figure raised a hand, its skin smooth and waxy, and pointed a long, unnaturally thin finger directly at the Precinct 4 badge in Jake's pocket. The silent, featureless figure, the Curator, stood utterly still. Its unnaturally long finger pointed directly at the burning Precinct 4 badge in Jake's pocket. The chilling crack of its neck movement stopped, leaving a heavy vacuum of sound. Jake's training screamed at him to fire, but his finger froze on the trigger. The figure wasn't just a threat, it was an aberration, defying every physical law he knew then. A sound emerged from the Curator's direction, not from its mouth, which was featureless, but from the air around it. It was a chorus of overlapping whispers, a horrible composite of different male and female voices, thin and mournful, weaving together into a single, cohesive statement. The inventory is disturbed. The artifact is unauthorized. URA violation. The voices were the echoes, the code 712. They were the missing officers, contained and channeled by this impossible entity. Jake took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The Curator moved. It didn't walk. It simply glided forward, its 1950s uniform rippling slightly in the frigid air. He realized the danger wasn't just physical. This thing knew about the badge. It was coming for the artifact. "Stay back," Jake roared, leveling the Glock. The sound of his own voice was swallowed immediately by the vast, silent room. He fired. Crack. The 9mm round struck the Curator squarely in the center of the chest. The impact was minimal, no blood, no stagger. The bullet simply wallowed in the thick wool of the coat for a moment, then dropped silently to the floor, flattened and dull. The Curator continued to advance, its head still tilted. The chorus of voices intensified. Ineffective. Irrelevant. Complete your file. Jake turned and ran, plunging deeper into the labyrinth of shelves. He moved erratically, cutting left and right, trying to lose the unholy entity. He could hear the faint, gliding shh of its wool coat turning the corners behind him. Always close, he rounded a corner and skidded to a stop. The aisle ended abruptly at a sheer brick wall. Trapped desperation fueled his gaze. He scanned the wall, noting a small, rusted metal plate low to the ground, almost hidden by a stack of old ledger books. The plate had a small, recessed handle. Jake dropped his gun, grabbed the handle, and yanked with all his strength. The plate tore loose with a screech of metal, revealing a dark, square aperture. A hidden service tunnel used for wiring or ventilation, barely large enough for a man to crawl through. He scrambled into the opening, throwing the ledger books aside. He barely had time to pull his legs in before the gliding shape of the Curator appeared at the end of the aisle. The chorus of whispers changed, laced now with cold fury. The structure is sacred. Unauthorized access. The Curator raised both hands. The towering steel shelves on either side of the aisle began to groan, twist, and buckle inwards, metal tearing against metal with a sound that felt like it was ripping Jake's eardrums. Jake didn't look back. He started crawling, the concrete beneath him damp and crumbling. The tunnel was dark and choked with dust. He crawled for what felt like an eternity. The muffled, industrial sounds of the collapsing evidence room fading behind him. Finally, the tunnel pitched downward sharply, opening into a small, echoing space. He slid out, landing hard on his shoulder that he looked around, raising his flashlight. He was in a massive, circular cavern beneath the precinct, supported by immense, salt-stained columns that resembled bone. The air here was heavy with the smell of seawater and something putrid. The floor was covered in an inch of murky, cold water, and hanging from the ceiling, secured by rusted chains, were hundreds of identical wooden boxes, suspended over the water, swaying slightly in the unseen currents. He focused his beam on the nearest box. It wasn't a box. It was a casket, small and unmarked. As he watched, a faint, rhythmic thump-thump sound began to emanate from one of the caskets further down the line, followed immediately by a sharp, cracking sound from inside the box, like dry wood splintering. Jake realized the truth of the south wing. It wasn't just an archive of the missing. It was a crypt, and he wasn't alone. From the darkness at the edge of the cavern, a new noise began, a low, guttural, dragging sound, like something heavy and wet being pulled across the damp concrete floor, moving slowly toward the center of the room. Officer Jake Riley scrambled away from the service tunnel exit, his breath misting in the frigid, damp air of the subterranean cavern. His flashlight beam frantically swept over the scene. The massive, circular room, the skeletal columns, and the hundreds of swaying, suspended wooden caskets, each one a chilling marker of a disappeared officer. The low, guttural dragging sound intensified, moving closer from the shadowed perimeter. It sounded heavy, wet, and deliberate. Jake realized he couldn't run through the caskets. He had to move along the perimeter. He kept his flashlight trained on the source of the noise, while backing away, that he risked a look at the nearest casket. It was old, the wood warped by the dampness, but faintly visible on the side was a small, brass plaque. He shone his light on it. G. Kincaid, 1998-032. The deputy marshal whose file he had handled moments ago. The files in the evidence room weren't cold cases. They were receipts that a sudden, sharp thump from the casket directly above Kincaid's made Jake flinch. The rhythmic, internal movement was picking up speed in several caskets, accompanied by the horrible sound of splintering wood. Jake pressed his back against a cold, salty column. The dragging sound had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It felt like a predator holding its breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Precinct 4 badge. It was scorching hot now, too hot to hold for long. He held it up, noticing a faint, almost invisible etching on the rear surface that he hadn't seen before. He wiped away the grime. The etching wasn't a serial number. It was a microscopic map of 3 intersecting lines forming a small, familiar symbol. It was the symbol of the Blackwood City Planning Commission, specifically used to designate abandoned municipal substructures. He tried to raise Alara again on the radio, pressing the mic button while holding the badge up to the light. The radio remained dead, spitting only static. But as he held the badge near the device, the static changed. It became a rhythmic, rapid series of 4 distinct, sharp clicks. Click, 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 click. That IT was a code. Morse code, perhaps, or something else. And it was emanating from the badge itself, resonating through the broken radio. Suddenly, the dragging sound erupted again, much closer, followed by a heavy splash. Jake whipped his head around. Emerging from the darkness, dripping cold water, was an entity that made the Curator seem orderly. It was a massive, hunched figure, its skin gray and distended, and its entire lower body was missing, replaced by a pulpy, ragged mass of exposed muscle and bone that dragged through the shallow water. That IT wore the remnants of a police uniform, a jacket and shirt, soaked and shredded, but the brass buttons glinted faintly. Its face was a terrifying, bloated caricature of human features, fixed in an expression of eternal, agonized screaming. Its hands, huge, swollen, and ending in blackened, broken fingernails, scrambled against the concrete, pulling its bulk forward. This was no spectral echo. This was the physical residue of what had happened here. The creature let out a sound, a low, desperate moan that didn't seem to be a threat, but a plea for help, corrupted by pain. Jake scrambled to his feet. He had to move. He threw his flashlight beam across the room, desperate for an exit. His light caught a flash of metal high up on a support column, a small, recessed metal ladder, leading up to a grating. Freedom. He took a running leap onto the column, his muscles screaming. As he started climbing, the dragging entity let out a shriek of pure rage and lunged, its huge, rotting hand swiping inches below his boot. He pulled himself onto the small platform and kicked at the metal grating above his head. It groaned and refused to budge as he struggled. The rhythmic clicking from the Precinct 4 badge in his pocket became intensely loud, echoing in the cavern. The entity below stopped struggling and looked up, its horrific face tilted, listening to the clicks. Then, Jake saw it, scrawled into the concrete of the platform beneath the grating. Written in what looked like dried, black blood, was a single, cryptic sentence. The architect builds in 3. Find the center, find the lie. He gave the grating one final, desperate kick. It sprang open with a shriek of rusted metal. He scrambled through, pulling the grating shut just as the raging roar of the creature below reached a crescendo. He was in a small, dusty storage room, but above him, he could hear the faint, comforting hum of the Precinct 7 main office ventilation. He was back within the known structure. He had escaped the crypt, but the badge was still clicking, and the entity's roar was echoing, no longer from below, but from the walls around him. Officer Jake Riley tumbled out of the service vent into a dimly lit, disorganized space. The Precinct 7 main records room. The air here was merely stale, a vast improvement from the crypt's putrid cold. He slammed the vent cover back into place and wedged a stack of outdated manuals against it. The intense roar of the creature from the cavern below faded into a low, pervasive growl that seemed to vibrate the very foundation of the precinct. The Precinct 4 badge was still clicking furiously in his pocket. Click, 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 click. The rhythmic pattern was insistent, drawing his attention to a specific corner of the room. A cluster of heavy, steel filing cabinets marked closed cases. PRE 1980. Jake followed the sound, his heart still racing. He reached the cabinets and pulled open the top drawer. The clicking stopped instantly, replaced by a deep, low hum from inside the drawer. He rifled through the folders until his fingers brushed against a thick, heavy document tied with red ribbon. It was an anomaly, not a case file, but a rolled-up blueprint. Stiff with age, he unfurled it on a nearby desk. The label at the bottom was faded but legible. Blackwood City Emergency Services Facility. Plan B. Site 7 Construction, 1978. The blueprint detailed Precinct 7, but the lower third of the document was dominated by an older, complex diagram labeled Foundation Base, Original Structure. Jake leaned closer, tracing the lines. The original structure, the foundation upon which Precinct 7 was built, was not a police station. It was a massive, circular building with three distinct, converging wings, matching the phrase he saw in the crypt. The architect builds in three. At the exact geometric middle of the circular foundation, the center, the blueprint showed a single, small, reinforced room. It was marked only with the symbol of the Blackwood City Planning Commission and the chilling inscription, the core. A new sound cut through the stillness, not from the building's unseen inhabitants, but from Jake's suddenly active radio. It wasn't the static of the crypt, but a broken, distorted voice, barely recognizable. "R.R. Riley. Riley, do you read me?" It was Alara Vance, her voice laced with a raw, panicked desperation. "Alara, I hear you. I'm in records. What is happening? The south wing, the crypt, the things down there. Stop talking about it." Alara hissed, the distortion amplifying her fear. "He knows when we talk about it. Listen, the power is fluctuating. The main system, it keeps trying to process the code 712. What is code 712? Jake demanded, staring at the core. On the blueprint, Alara's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "It's not an echo. It's a recollection. It's the building trying to remember what it contains. Riley, you found something, didn't you? Something old. I found a blueprint," Jake said, his eyes scanning the map. Precinct 7 is built on a massive, circular foundation, three wings converging on a point called the core. "What is the core, Alara?" A short, sharp burst of static erupted, followed by Alara's voice, now unnervingly clear, chillingly calm. "The center is where the records become permanent, Riley. It's where the architect keeps his files. It's the only place they can't reach you." The sudden calm in her voice was a terrifying red flag. "Alara, why did you change the subject? Who is the architect?" Silence, long and agonizing, when Alara spoke again. Her voice was back to the frantic, static-laced whisper. "I don't know who, but I know what. Don't go to the core, Riley. That's what he wants. You need to find the override. It's the only way to lock him out. It's in the old communications relay room, near the old ventilation shaft. Go now, Riley, and leave the badge. He senses the unauthorized archive." Jake looked at the Precinct 4 badge, resting on the blueprint. He senses the unauthorized archive. The Curator wasn't after him. It was after the badge. The evidence that the structure's inventory was incomplete. He shoved the badge deep into his pocket and grabbed the blueprint. "I'm going for the relay room. Give me directions." The radio went silent. Jake tapped the transmission button repeatedly. Nothing. Alara was gone, leaving him with a terrifying blueprint and a single, desperate mission. As he moved to the door, a low, metallic scraping sound came from the adjacent locker room, a sound that was neither the gliding of the Curator nor the dragging of the residue. It was a sound of slow, heavy, deliberate movement of something structural in the walls, shifting the very geometry of the building. The lights in the records room flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness, illuminating only the faint, sickening glow of the blueprint on the desk. When the lights returned, the door to the records room was gone, replaced by a solid, seamless section of gray concrete. It was sealed in again. The seamless concrete wall, where the records room door had been, was a chilling testament to the structure's conscious malice. The scraping sound continued, low and unsettling, suggesting the entire precinct was slowly, physically, rearranging itself around Officer Jake Riley. He had no time for panic. He spread the ancient blueprint out, the glowing Plan B, design a beacon in the oppressive room. The only egress shown from the sealed records room was a small, decommissioned ventilation shaft marked Access Route, Comms Relay. Jake found the shaft cover hidden behind a broken photocopier. It was bolted shut. He used the butt of his Glock to smash the lock mechanism. The loud thwack echoing sharply, he pulled the cover off and climbed into the tight, square shaft. He crawled quickly, the heavy air thick with insulation dust and the metallic scent of old electrical currents. The Precinct 4 badge remained hot, a constant, low burn in his pocket, seemingly reacting to the proximity of the building's vital systems. After 10 minutes of claustrophobic effort, he reached the end, kicking open a thin grating. He tumbled into the communications relay room. The room was a relic, a small, dark closet dominated by a massive, antiquated switchboard and a rack of dusty, humming servers with flashing green lights. The central nervous system of Precinct 7's ancient radio and record systems. His eyes immediately went to the far wall. There it was, a small, separate panel labeled System Override, Emergency Isolation. But as his flashlight swept across the panel, his blood ran cold. The override panel was already damaged. A section of the circuit board had been ripped out, the wires hanging like severed nerves, scorched and sparking faintly. And standing silently in front of the damaged panel was a new entity. The IT was not solid like the Curator, nor physically corrupted like the residue. This was pure light and despair. It was the Echo. The source of the code 712.IT manifested as a swirling vortex of cold, white light shaped into the hazy, translucent form of a woman. She was wearing clothes that dissolved into the air, and her head was tilted back, her mouth stretched wide in an eternal, silent scream. As Jake aimed his flashlight, the Echo turned its translucent face toward him. The light passed through her, scattering across the far wall, where it projected an image, a fleeting, horrific shadow play of the woman being violently shoved against a desk, followed by a heavy, wet thud. The screaming woman from the radio anomaly. The recollection that Alara spoke of, the Echo didn't move toward him. It simply hovered, its silent scream growing in intensity, radiating a pure, crushing wave of despair that threatened to buckle Jake's knees. It was waiting, guarding the damaged override. Jake slowly moved forward, his hand out, trying to find a working segment of the panel. "I need to shut the system down," he whispered, trying to appeal to the ghost of the victim. The Echo reacted by focusing its silent scream on the remaining, functional portion of the override panel. The components began to vibrate violently, tiny bursts of smoke rising from the circuitry as the memory, the recollection, overloading the system. Jake realized he couldn't reason with a memory. He needed a distraction. He pulled the scorching Precinct 4 badge from his pocket. He stared at the brass shield, then at the screaming Echo. Both were manifestations of unauthorized, archived information. With a desperate cry, Jake hurled the badge across the room, past the Echo. The brass shield struck the far wall. With a sharp clatter, the Echo's silent scream snapped off. The vortex of white light spun violently, breaking its focus on the override, and darted toward the badge, consuming the artifact in a furious, blinding flash of light. In the momentary chaos, Jake lunged at the override panel. He slammed his hand onto a small, glowing toggle switch he recognized from his academy days. The power isolator. Click! The rack of servers immediately went dark. The humming stopped. The building plunged into complete, sudden silence and darkness. No echoes, no growls, no scraping. The structural violence ceased. Jake stood in the absolute dark, his ears ringing. The only sound is ragged breathing. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by simple, natural cold. He had done it. He had isolated the system. He pulled out his flashlight. The Echo was gone. The Precinct 4 badge was gone. But in the center of the relay room floor, where the Echo had been hovering, the faint light of his beam revealed a small, newly formed pool of thick, black oil, slowly spreading across the tile. And pressed into the center of the viscous oil was a single, tiny, perfectly formed object. A miniature, smooth steel replica of the Precinct 7 building. He picked it up. It was cold, smooth, and heavy. He heard a tiny, muffled thump from inside the small steel shell. Then, from the darkness of the main station beyond the relay room door, a voice spoke. Not an echo, not a whisper, but a normal, tired, human voice laced with grim satisfaction. "You should have left the artifact, Riley. You've only made the architect angry." The sound of the normal, tired voice in the darkness hit Officer Jake Riley harder than any jump scare. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the blackness, and found Desk Sergeant Alara Vance standing just outside the relay room door. She looked exactly as she had at the start of the shift, haggard, weary, and wearing the same anxious expression, but the anxiety was now replaced by a chilling, profound resignation. She was no longer afraid. "Alara, you're all right. Why are you out here? The power is down." Alara stepped into the relay room, her boots crunching faintly on the dust. She held a heavy, old-fashioned lantern that cast long, flickering shadows. "I'm fine, Riley," she said, her voice flat. "Better than fine, actually. The screaming has stopped." She nodded towards the dark wall, where the echo had vanished. "You muted the memory. Smart boy. Muted? Ilara, I shut down the entire system. And what was that thing? And where did the Precinct 4 badge go?" Ilara sighed, an act of weariness that seemed decades old. "The badge? It's returned to the archive. The echo was the overflow, the structure's bad dream. You stopped it from remembering its victim for a while. But the architect, he doesn't need the system to function. He is the function." She stepped closer, her eyes, the color of faded blue denim, fixed on the tiny steel replica in Jake's hand. "Give me the key, Riley." "The key? The miniature station. It's what he uses to stabilize the geometry. You disrupted his inventory, so he created a control surface for you. It's a test, Riley. You've angered him by leaving the fold, but you've also earned his attention." Jake instinctively tightened his grip on the steel model. "You know all of this. You knew about the South Wing, the crypt, the files. You're the one who told me to ignore code 712. Ilara's expression softened into something almost maternal, yet deeply unsettling. "I am the caretaker, Jake. I maintain the borders. I warn the new acquisitions. I ensure the routine is followed. My rule number 3? Don't go looking for the permanent record. You broke it. So you were protecting the architect. I was protecting the peace," Ilara corrected gently. "The architect is the structure itself. The core is his brain. When you entered the South Wing, you activated the retrieval sequence. He sends the Curator to file your evidence, and the residue to enforce the physical boundaries. You have violated the sacred space." Jake felt a sickening lurch of understanding. Ilara wasn't a victim. She was a willing, terrified accomplice to the building's consciousness. "Where are the others, Ilara? The missing officers, Rourke, Kincaid, Sterling? Are they all trapped down there?" "Their files are complete," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "Their stories are cataloged. Now give me the key. I will return it to the center, and the building will let you walk out the front door, just as I let the others walk in." Jake looked at the miniature steel station. The muffled thump he had heard earlier was still there, but now it was a faint, frantic tapping. "No, I'm not leaving," Jake stated, raising his flashlight. "You said the core is where they can't reach me. I'm going to the core, and I'm going to find out what the architect truly is." Ilara's face hardened. The resigned weariness vanished, replaced by a cold, frightening clarity. "You don't understand. The core isn't a safe room. It's the final file. Once you enter, your classification is permanent. But if you insist on the journey—" She raised the lantern, her shadow stretching impossibly long and distorted across the wall. "The architect is now steering the structure. The path to the core changes every 60 seconds. You have the key. You will need it to unlock the way." She gestured toward the door, which was now a regular, fire-rated door leading into a corridor, but one Jake didn't recognize. "Go, Riley. The clock is ticking. You have 12 shifts until your file is complete." As Jake stepped out into the dark, unfamiliar corridor, he heard Ilara's tired voice call out one last, chilling warning from the dark relay room. "The architect's greatest weapon is time, Riley. It turns every patrolman into a ghost." Officer Jake Riley stepped out of the communications relay room and into a corridor that felt utterly wrong. It was too wide for Precinct 7, the tile work mismatched, and the ceiling too low. The air was cold, but now carried the distinct, synthetic smell of cheap industrial cleaning fluid, a smell characteristic of the now-demolished Precinct 4. Ilara's words echoed in his mind. "The path to the core changes every 60 seconds. He gripped a small, heavy steel replica of Precinct 7, the key. He noticed a faint, red light glowing from the miniature front door of the replica, and a tiny compass rose etched into the base. The north arrow was spinning erratically, then locked onto a direction, a dark, unmarked door at the end of the hall. 60 seconds, Jake muttered. Starting to jog, he followed the compass, turning down a side corridor that abruptly narrowed, the walls seemingly closing in around him. The geometry of the building was actively remodeling. He checked the key again. The red light shifted, now pointing sharply to a ventilation grate near the floor. He kicked it open and plunged through, scrambling into the next space, just as the previous corridor's walls slammed shut. With a sickening, grinding sound, he emerged into what looked like a derelict booking area. The desk scarred, and the glass partition shattered. The key now pointed straight through a heavily reinforced closet door. Jake tried the knob. Locked. He had no time to pick it. He slammed his shoulder against the door once, twice. The wood groaning did on the third attempt. A new, loud sound erupted from the hallway behind him. A high-pitched, metallic whirring, followed by the frantic, rapid clicks of an archaic mechanical shutter opening and closing. He looked back. The hallway was gone, replaced by a deep, dark shaft. Emerging from the darkness, gliding on silent runners, was the archive guard. It was a tall, skeletal frame built of polished brass and steel, resembling a 1940s-era clockwork automaton. Its head was a large, spherical lens that whirred and focused, scanning the room. Its hands were long, thin metallic claws ending in razor-sharp styluses. The guard let out a sound, a synthetic, clicking voice. Unauthorized presence detected. Inventory violation. Protocol. Contain and classify. The archive guard raised its clawed hands and began to scratch the surface of the scarred booking desk. The metal stylus scraped deep grooves into the wood, forming neat, precise letters. It wasn't carving a threat. It was carving a report. Jake threw himself at the closet door one last time. The lock splintered. He burst inside, grabbing the miniature key just as the archive guard stopped carving and let out a synthesized siren wail, its brass body swiveling to face the closet. Jake found himself in a small, damp storage alcove. The key's red light was blazing, pointing down, specifically at a heavy, cast-iron manhole cover set into the concrete floor. The temporary access point, he wedged his pry bar into the manhole cover and heaved. It resisted, but then the rusted seal broke with a loud sucking hiss. The archive guard's synthesized voice boomed from just outside the alcove. Containment window. 10 seconds. Compliance is mandatory. Jake gripped the edge of the manhole cover and pulled it aside. Beneath was a dark, humid shaft leading down, filled with the loud, hissing sound of pressurized steam. He jumped in without hesitation, dropping onto a precarious ladder. The air was thick and scalding. He started climbing down, his hands burning. Above him, the archive guard's brass claws scraped against the metal rim of the manhole cover. Jake felt a blast of searing steam and pulled his hands away. Barely maintaining his grip on the ladder, he looked down, his flashlight beam struggling to penetrate the steam. The ladder ended abruptly about 20 feet below, suspended over a dark, vast chamber. The archive guard's voice echoed down the shaft, calmer now, colder. You have reached the structural intersection. Proceed to the core. The master awaits his final file. Jake reached the end of the ladder. Beneath him, the chamber was a dizzying, complex intersection of pipes and massive, rotating gears, the physical mechanics of the building's shifting geometry. It was the structural intersection, the pivot point of the three converging wings shown on the blueprint. He took a desperate leap off the ladder, landing hard on a narrow, oily metal walkway that encircled the massive, turning machinery. The noise of the machinery was deafening, a relentless, grinding roar. The key in his hand was now glowing violently, the miniature front door flashing red. It was pointing directly across the chamber, to a single, small, reinforced door, exactly where the core was located on the blueprint. As Jake started across the vibrating walkway, he noticed something horrifying caught between two grinding gears. A tattered piece of wool, black with grease, but recognizable as the fabric from the Curator's 1950s uniform. He realized the true horror of the structural intersection. It was where the building's various entities were maintained, repaired, and, sometimes, recycled. Jake looked back up the shaft. The archive guard was gone, its mission apparently complete. He had reached the point of no return. That he had the key. He had the map in his memory, and he was at the structural intersection. The core was ahead. Officer Jake Riley pushed through the small, reinforced door, stepping out of the deafening roar of the structural intersection into a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. He was in the core, The room was a startling anomaly against the decaying horror of Precinct 7. It was a perfectly modern, sterile, minimalist office space, brightly lit by recessed LED panels. The air was cool and clean, smelling faintly of ozone and freshly printed paper. It was an office from the future, seamlessly inserted into the decaying heart of the past. In the center of the room sat a single, dark oak desk. Behind the desk, seated in a high-backed ergonomic chair, was the architect. He was not a monster. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a crisp, well-tailored suit. His hair was neatly combed, and he wore thin, frameless glasses. He looked entirely unassuming, perhaps an auditor or a city council member. A man of paperwork and control. He didn't look up immediately. He was calmly reading from a thick, leather-bound folder labeled Vance, Alara, Caretaker Assessment. "Officer Riley," the architect said, his voice calm, measured, and possessing the distinct, dry quality of someone who spends all day explaining complex regulations. "You've been resourceful. Your journey was unconventional, but efficient. Please, take a seat." He gestured toward a sleek visitor's chair. Jake remained standing, his flashlight aimed squarely at the man. "What is this place? What did you do to those officers?" The architect placed the folder down, sighing gently. He looked up, his eyes a disconcerting shade of pale gray. "This is the center of classification. And to answer your second question, I did nothing. The structure did. I merely designed the system." He gestured to the walls, which were lined with thousands of deep, metallic cubbies, each one containing an identically labeled, thick manila folder. They were organized perfectly, from 1978 to the present day. "Every municipal structure has a flaw, Riley. A design error. The flaw in this city's justice system is incompletion. The missing files, the lost witnesses, the unsolved cases, the emotional energy of that unresolved suffering. It destabilizes the urban framework." "So you built this machine?" "Precisely. Precinct 7 isn't a building. It's a mechanism for structural stability. The architect's job is to archive that unstable energy. The curator organizes the physical evidence. The residue enforces compliance. The echo processes the memory. And I, the architect, generate the final file." He tapped the desktop. "You saw the files of Rourke and Kincaid. Their lives were unfinished. Their cases were incomplete. When an officer vanishes within these walls, their unfinished story, their fear, their despair, that energy is converted and stored. It provides the literal, structural stability that prevents the city from collapsing into anarchy. Their suffering is the foundation." He reached beneath the desk and pulled out a new manila folder. It was pristine, the label blank. He picked up a pen and, in the same neat, sloping script Jake recognized from the evidence room, he wrote the date, November 9th, 2025. "You brought the key," the architect continued, nodding at the miniature steel station in Jake's hand. "It proves you have the rare combination of curiosity and persistence required for the role." He leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. "You have reached the center. Your file is open. You now have a choice, Riley. It is the same choice I offered Alara." He pushed the pristine, blank folder across the desk toward Jake. "Option 1, the file is complete. You give me the key. I enter your name here, and your story, your fear, your exhaustion, your unique experience of the past 8 hours will be archived as a permanent file, stabilizing the North Wing for the next decade. Your body will be respectfully disposed of in the crypt." He then slid the heavy, completed folder labeled Vance, Alara towards Jake. "Option 2, the caretaker. You accept the truth of this structure. You take Alara's place, maintaining the borders, advising the curator, and ensuring the smooth process of new acquisitions. You will be safe, you will be ageless, but you will never leave these walls. You will be responsible for filing the next patrolman who breaks Rule 3. The architect smiled, a professional, humorless expression. Alara has grown tired of the noise. She is ready for her transfer to the crypt. Which choice will it be, Officer Riley? Will you become the next foundation or the next gatekeeper? Officer Jake Riley stared across the pristine desk at the unervingly calm architect. The choices were laid out before him. The blank, awaiting file of permanent imprisonment, or the completed, weary file of eternal servitude. Neither, Jake said, his voice firm, though his entire body was shaking with adrenaline. The architect raised an eyebrow, a flicker of irritation crossing his otherwise placid features. A third option? That is illogical, officer. The system allows only 2 classifications at the center. Jake's eyes darted from the architect's hand, resting casually near his pen, to the miniature steel key still heavy in Jake's own hand. The key was silent now, absorbing the oppressive stillness of the core. You said I made the architect angry by leaving the fold, but I earned his attention, Jake pointed out, and Alara said the path to the core changes every 60 seconds. That means you had to actively steer the structure to let me get here. You had to use this. He lifted the steel replica. It is a control surface, the architect conceded, a hint of pride in his voice. A remote link to the shifting geometry. Necessary, yes, for maintaining the illusion of a contiguous building. And that's the flaw, Jake said, realization clicking into place with cold precision. The structure is supposed to archive human suffering, but you are still human. You built this out of fear of disorder, not out of structural necessity. The moment you need to physically intervene, the geometry has to stabilize. The building stops archiving and starts existing as a weapon. The architect's smile vanished. His pale eyes narrowed. A bold theory, officer, and utterly irrelevant to your current predicament. It's the only relevant thing, Jake countered. When I shut down the override, the chaos stopped. When I used the key to navigate, the geometry became hostile but stable. You're only safe as long as you have the perfect order of this room. You need the key to control the outside, and you need that file to control me. He snatched the thick, leather-bound file labeled Vance, Alara, Caretaker Assessment from the desk. You want the key back? Let's make a trade, Jake snarled, his voice breaking. Before the architect could react, Jake made his move. He didn't use his gun. He hurled the key, the miniature steel replica, not at the architect, but with all his force at the massive server rack built into the wall behind the desk. The heavy steel miniature struck the servers with a deafening, shattering impact. The bright LED lights in the core flickered violently and died, plunging the room into darkness. Simultaneously, the perfect silence was shattered by a deafening, high-pitched screech, the sound of metal rending and concrete shearing, erupting from the walls of the sterile office. The structural chaos Jake had only experienced outside was now violently breaching the core. Violation. Irrelevant. The architect's voice was no longer calm. It was a synthesized, distorted roar, laced with the metallic grating of structural stress. Jake brought up his flashlight. The architect was no longer sitting. He was standing, his hands clutching the edges of the desk. His tailored suit was ripping at the seams as his human form began to bulge and distort. His skin stretched taut, turning a sickly gray, and his eyes glowed with an internal, furious, sulphurous light. The architect is not merely a man, the creature shrieked, the voice splitting into 1,000 echoes. I am the plan. I am the order. The elegant oak desk cracked in half as the architect lunged over it. Jake dodged, diving toward the crumpled server rack where the key lay. The walls of the core were splitting open, revealing the rough, brick-and-mortar reality of the foundation beneath. The floor began to tilt. Jake scrambled to the broken server rack. He grabbed the miniature steel key. It was now hot, vibrating, and cracked down the middle. As he picked it up, he saw his chance. The Vance, Alara file was still clutched in his left hand. You need to maintain order, Jake yelled over the noise of the collapsing room, pointing the torchlight at the file. And I know your next filing. He didn't wait. He ripped open the Vance file, pulling out the thick stack of papers, Alara's life, her despair, her decisions, the entire archive of her existence as caretaker. He threw the papers at the now monstrous architect, who recoiled with a terrible, rasping sound, shielding his rapidly dehumanizing face with the huge, distended hand. No, the file is sacred. Jake didn't hesitate. He jammed the broken, vibrating key. the ultimate control surface, into the biggest, most exposed crack in the collapsing wall of the core. The structural noise reached an impossible peak. The building didn't just shake, it locked up. The lights went out, the air went silent, and the entire structure of Precinct 7, and the monster that controlled it, froze in mid-transformation, trapped between one geometry and the next. The silence that followed the structural lockup was absolute, a heavy, dead stillness that pressed against the eardrums. Officer Jake Riley found himself in complete darkness within the shattered remains of the core. He couldn't hear the monstrous, tearing sound of the architect's transformation anymore. He couldn't hear the grinding gears of the structural intersection. Everything was frozen, locked, and silent. He pulled out his flashlight. The key, the broken, steel replica jammed into the wall, had acted like a massive, catastrophic system override, freezing the structure in its last, chaotic state. The architect was nowhere to be seen, having either reverted to his human form and vanished or been absorbed by the sudden, rigid silence. Jake looked at the gaping crack in the wall where he had jammed the key. It revealed a cramped, dusty space, a decommissioned ventilation shaft, the same kind he had used to reach the relay room. It was an escape path created by the building's own frozen violence. He scrambled through the opening, leaving the broken key vibrating faintly in the wall, an anchor pinning the monster in place. He crawled through the dark, cold tunnels for what felt like miles, until he reached a loose grating. He shoved it open and tumbled out onto a familiar tiled floor. He was back in the main entrance hallway of Precinct 7. The room was still and cold. The fluorescent lights overhead were off, and the air smelled of stale coffee and dust, as it had on his first shift. But now the silence was permanent. The ominous echo was muted. He walked past the deserted desk sergeant station. Ilara Vance was gone, her fate sealed by the open file. Jake grabbed his jacket and walked out the front doors, not looking back at the brick mausoleum. 5 years later, Jake Riley was no longer a cop. He worked as an architectural surveyor for Blackwood City Planning, a stable, quiet job. He lived in a clean, brightly lit apartment far from the industrial shadows. He never spoke of his last shift. The official story was that Precinct 7 had suffered a massive, localized electrical failure, forcing its permanent closure and immediate condemnation. The entire building was sealed with reinforced concrete and surrounded by an imposing security fence. One rainy afternoon, Jake was reviewing a geological survey report for the old industrial district. He reached the section on Site 7. The report was marked structurally sound but geometrically unstable. He opened his desk drawer and reached for his old police badge. Next to it lay a small, tarnished wedding band engraved with DR and the date November 14th, 01, Detective Rourke's ring, which he'd found in the crypt. The only physical evidence of his night of terror. The memory of Ilara Vance returned to him, her resigned weariness, her terror, and her final words. The architect's greatest weapon is time. It turns every patrolman into a ghost. Jake knew he had only stabilized the structure, not defeated it. The architect was trapped, but the system remained dormant, waiting for a chance to break the silence. He thought of the missing officers, the permanent files, and the endless suffering that fueled the city's false peace. Jake picked up a heavy red pen, a surveyor's tool, and drew a single, thick line across the Site 7 blueprint, right over the center point of the sealed building. He paused, then wrote one clear, final word next to the line. Demolish. He had